Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael David Fox from the History Department and the School of Foreign Service, and I'm really delighted to welcome Gabriel Gorodetsky here to Georgetown. The talk is co-sponsored by the Russian History Seminar, Washington, D.C., and the series program at SFS, and I'm going to give you just a very brief introduction to the biography of our distinguished speaker today. He is a Quondam Fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and holds the Samuel Rubin Chair of Russian East European History and Civilization at Tel Aviv University. He completed his BA at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, went on to write a DPhil dissertation in Russian Studies at Oxford under the supervision of E.H. Carr. He was a professor of Russian Studies at Tel Aviv University from 1974 to 2005, and founder of the Cummings Center for Russian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He has been a visiting professor and fellow at places too numerous to mention, but I do want to give you a sense of his published writings, because Professor Gorodetsky has published very widely on Soviet foreign policy in the interwar period and on the Second World War. His books include The Precarious Truce, Anglo-Soviet Relations, 1924 to 1927, Stafford Critz's Mission to Moscow, 1940 to 42, and in Russian, Myth Ledakola, published in 1995 in Moscow, and then Grand Delusion, Stalin and the German Invasion of Russia, which came out with Yale in 1999 and has been translated into French, German, Russian, and Hebrew. He has been working on an extensive annotated version of the diary of the Soviet ambassador to London, Ivan Maisky. And I would say on a personal note, having dipped into the diary of Maisky just a little bit, I realized what a fascinating source this is, and everyone started telling me that Gabriel Gorodetsky is publishing a definitive annotated version, so I'm very pleased to actually hear some of the fruits of his research today. It's going to be published in 3 volumes by Yale University Press. He's also preparing a sequel to The Grand Delusion on the formation of the Grand Alliance in World War II. And the title of his talk today is The Dramatis Personae Behind the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So, Professor Gorodetsky.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming here in this very rainy and unwelcoming weather. I'd like to thank President David Fox for inviting me and giving me this opportunity of talking to you today. He actually just told me that the part he likes best in the lectures is the questions and answers. So perhaps we can start right away with that and do where we might later. But obviously I would be delighted to discuss many of the topics that I'm going to raise today in the talk with you later on. I'm not going to use in PowerPoint any documents, maybe just one, but just as a sort of introductory word, what I will try to show while I'm talking are photos which I found in Maisky's private archives. I had access to all his private albums, which is so rare, of course, with Russian politicians or ambassadors. And so I'll just illustrate here and there the lecture with some of the photos that I found. Well, in 1839, Marquis de Custine, whose entire family had been sent to the guillotine, sought to console himself in Imperial Russia, the bastion of monarchical rule in Europe. He came back appalled, warning that the Russians were Chinese masquerading as Europeans. 2 centuries later, we find the British politician Harold Nicholson describing in his diary a lunch at Ivan Maisky's embassy in London, which he dismissed as a green Victorian mansion. I was ushered into a room of unexampled horror, he continues, where we were given Coke cherry while a man with a yellow mustache and a mujik's unappetizing daughter carried tableware and bananas into the room beyond. During the whole meal, I felt that there was something terribly familiar about it all. And then, suddenly I realized it was the East. They were playing at being Europeans. They had gone Oriental. Churchill's description of Russia in 1939 as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma was far more flattering than his earlier metaphors, comparing them to crocodiles, a bubonic plague, or the wild grizzly bear. Such metaphors were only too common in Britain. The Russians' images of the West were neither immune from xenophobia. The debate on Russia's identity and place in the world had been launched by the Russian intelligentsia in the early 1830s and is still raging unabated today. Images of Western or bourgeois decadence figured prominently in the minds. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact has sparked a sustained controversy ever since it was signed on the 23rd of August 1939. Stalin was accused in the West of transforming Russia overnight from a champion of anti-fascism into virtually an ally of Nazi Germany. It triggered a rancorous and crude response by Soviet historiography. Playing down the cooperation with Hitler, the rebuttal suggested that the policy of appeasement pursued by Britain and France was in fact an anti-Soviet conspiracy designed to embroil Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany in a mutually debilitating war. My contention is that neither the presentation of the Soviet Union as a champion of an anti-fascist moral crusade, nor as Hitler's secret suitor, adequately deal with the complexity revealed by the full range of the now available evidence. As questionable are the visions produced recently by Professor Cardy and Roberts. Both had plunged into the Soviet archives and came up with a thesis which, for all intents and purposes, is a refined narrative of the official Russian historiography, claiming that it was the Western rejection of collective security which left Stalin with no choice but to sign an agreement with Germany at the 12th hour. The narrative I would like to present today is based on the assumption that emotions and logic in the formulation of foreign policy are intertwined, regardless of the inevitable ideological bias of the governments at play. It shifts the discussion from the traditional ideology realpolitik dichotomy by introducing the additional but vital cultural and personal aspects of policy making. Seen from both the Western and Russian perspectives, vindictiveness and resentment, drawing on the legacy of the imperial rivalry and enhanced by the advance of communism, gave rise to preconceived ideas and mutual suspicion, which in turn shaped policies and were, as I would like to argue today, the single most important contributor to the calamitous events leading to the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which unleashed the Second World War. In presenting my case, I crossed the voluminous and candid diary of Ivan Maisky, his private papers and those of his interlocutors, with the official Soviet and Western archival sources. Maisky's earlier revolutionary activities led to his expulsion from St. Petersburg University in 1902 and exile to Siberia, where he gravitated towards the Menshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. In 1908, he went on exile, obtaining a PhD in economics from Munich University. In 1912, he joined the large community of Russian political exiles in London. There, he befriended Chicherin and Litvinov, who for 2 decades were to steer Soviet foreign policy as commissars for foreign affairs, and Alexandra Kollontai, the famous feminist, first ever female ambassador, eventually posted to Stockholm. Shortly after the February Revolution, of 1917, Maisky returned to Russia and joined Kerensky's government as the Deputy Minister of Labor. His politics were fast veering to the right of the Menshevik Party. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1918 led Maisky to join the ill-fated Komoch government, which at one point even collaborated with the white general Kolchak. Maisky thereby supported the sole-arm socialist insurgents against Bolshevism. The fact that he succeeded in being admitted to the Bolshevik Party in 1922, after making a formal and a rather humiliating repentance, says much about his political and manipulative skills. I should stress, though, that this stain in his past would continue to haunt him for the rest of his life, particularly during the dark days of the Great Terror, leading to his arrest and trial at the age of 70 in 1953. Back in Moscow, Maisky's fraternal relations with Chichern and Litvinov proved propitious. His survival instincts, manipulative power, and above all intelligence and capabilities earned for him the post of a counselor at the London embassy. It was followed by a similar appointment to Tokyo and a meteoric rise to the ambassadorial post in Helsinki. The hasty decision to appoint Maisky as ambassador to London at the end of 1932 reflected Litvinov's apprehension that Weimar Germany was on her last leg and that the advance of Nazism required a dramatic turnabout in relations with Great Britain. It marked a shift from attempts to mobilize support for the Russian Revolution among labor circles to courting the conservatives, who were, as Litvinov kept insisting, the real bosses in England. This looks so much like a 19th century group, a sort of team. During his first 4 years in London, Maisky succeeded indeed in spreading his net of acquaintances to all walks of life, political as well as cultural, and bringing about the normalization of relations. This he did by heralding a new style of revolutionary diplomacy, entirely unconventional at that time, of successfully manipulating the press and exerting pressure on the government through intimate collaboration with the opposition. The effectiveness of his brilliant diplomacy and creativity was, however, cut short by the Great Terror unleashed by Stalin in earnest in 1937. The terror, it is important to remember, coincided with Chamberlain's rise to power in May 1937 and the subsequent drift towards appeasement. To overcome Chamberlain's ideological and cultural bias against the USSR, Maisky cultivated the opposition of Eden, Churchill, the press magnate Lord Beaverbrook, and the aging but still volatile parliamentarian Lloyd George. Your Stalin, Lloyd George told Maisky, is quite different from Chamberlain. He is big and very decisive man. He has a strong grip. He can impress dictators, and he is capable of successfully repulsing Hitler and Mussolini. In 1937, Maisky forged particularly close relations with Churchill. The diary is saturated with unknown conversations they held over the next 6 years. Unlike Chamberlain, Churchill argued from the outset that the axis of Germany, Italy, and Japan was directed against the British Empire rather than against the USSR. The main task for all of us who defend the cause of peace, Churchill told Maisky, is to stick together, otherwise we are ruined. He was, however, most troubled by the public trials in Moscow. Lately I hear, he said, that a bitter domestic struggle is underway in Russia, that your army is on the verge of degeneration and has lost its fighting capability, and that Russia, broadly speaking, has ceased to exist as a serious factor in foreign politics. After a minute's pause, as if answering his own thoughts, Churchill exclaimed, "I am definitely in favor of Stalin's policy. Stalin is creating a strong Russia. We need a strong Russia, and I wish Stalin every success." Though the terror had been examined in depth in recent years, its impact on the conduct of Soviet foreign policy had been neglected. True, it is commonly recognized that the purges of the military had undermined the Soviet credibility as a partner in collective security, though it may well be argued that they tend to confirm existing doubts and prejudices rather than lead to a completely new evaluation. However, as disastrous and entirely overlooked by historians is the impact of the purges on the Soviet diplomacy and the formulation and execution of Soviet foreign policy. The three waves of purges at Narkomindel, the Russian Foreign Ministry, coincided with the events leading to the outbreak of the war. They commenced at the end of 1937, gathered momentum at the Munich conference, and reached the peak with the dismissal of Litvinov and the cleansing of Narkomindel in May 1939. Though the purges in the ministry could be attributed to Stalin's fear that the war might lead to a formation of a fifth column and therefore had to be nipped in the bud, they marked just as well the long-standing conflict between Stalin's Politburo and the elite of the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. Stalin was determined to eradicate the prevailing double allegiances to him personally and to the patrons in the various party and state institutions. The cadre at the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, far from blindly following his dictations, was particularly vulnerable. Key recruitments had been made personally by Chicherin and Litvinov from cosmopolitan, polyglot, and independent-minded intellectuals, bred on the legacy of the revolutionary intelligentsia of the Tsarist days. Needless to say that cosmopolitanism implied contamination by direct contact with the seductive bourgeois and degenerated social democratic environment. The terror led to a wiping out of the old guard at the Commissariat, with very few ambassadors surviving at the post. It dramatically curtailed the rather surprising latitude they had enjoyed in the conduct of foreign policy prior to the purges. The past winter and the current summer, Maisky lamented in a letter to his brother, have been very agitated, and this has greatly affected my health. It had a horrific effect on my nerves, my attention, and consequently on my day-to-day work. Maisky's oblique comments are typical for the quelled depression and passivity which had struck the Soviet diplomatic corps. That circumspection and passivity had clearly become the order of the day is well manifested in the paucity of entries in Maisky's diary for the second half of 1937. An indiscreet comment or an emotional flare could be fatal. The solution sought was often in the form of seemingly innocuous hints and innuendos, tacitly understood by the correspondents but hardly incriminating. A love letter Maisky wrote to his wife, Agnia, on the wedding anniversary is saturated with allusions to the fragility of the future and the need to celebrate the fleeting moment. It is preceded by two lines from Anatoly Nekrasov's foreboding poem, A New Year. And what has once been taken from life, fate is powerless to take back. Dear beloved, he wrote to her, the poet is right. The future will bring what it brings, but the 15 years we have spent together are ours, and nobody can do anything to change them. Agnia's brother-in-law, by the way, had just been arrested and sent to a gulag never to be seen again. An astounding survivor of the terror, Maisky was quick to realize that the appointment of Chamberlain as Prime Minister might encourage Moscow to retreat to isolation, which in turn might hasten the outbreak of the war. A dramatic rift, which hitherto been completely overlooked by historians, and with serious ramifications for the events leading to the pact, was widening between the ambassador and Litvinov, his custodian in Moscow. We sometimes prefer Litvinov attempted in vain to educate his protege in London. to be isolated rather than go along with the bad actions of others. And that is why isolation does not scare us. However, with the ferocious purges still raging, Maisky knew perfectly well that his own personal survival had become tied up with the promotion and success of collective security, for which his extraordinary connections in London were vital. Henceforth, he would perform a delicate tightrope walking, providing Moscow with objective evaluation while stubbornly maintaining that a long-term British shift towards collective security was inevitable. At first, he hoped the aggression of Hitler would force Chamberlain to alter his policies. But the year 1938 started with reversals, following the resignations of Anthony Eden as Foreign Secretary and his replacement by the hostile Lord Halifax. Even worse was the muted reaction to Hitler's annexation of Austria on the 12th of March, which strengthened the hands of Molotov and those in the Kremlin advocating a gradual Soviet retreat from collective security. A retreat to isolation, which, I really must stress, was an imposed policy rather than self-inflicted or ideologically inspired, as is often suggested. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that isolation was in any way related to Lenin's 1916 ideological premises, which saw in a non-intervention in an inter-imperialist war a prelude to a revolution. As time drew nearer to Maisky's departure for his 1938 summer vacation, in the far more terrifying annual hearings for ambassadors by the NKVD, his reports to Litvinov conveyed the conviction, mostly sustained by his conversations with Churchill or George and Beaverbrook, that, and I quote, the ground was systematically shifting under the English government's feet. Before leaving to Moscow, he made sure that Lloyd George would provide him with, and I quote, a warm message of admiration for Stalin as the greatest statesman alive. He further informed the elderly liberal of his whereabouts in Russia, while maintaining a constant flow of correspondence during his absence. Kollontai, who too was recalled at the same time, wrote a morbid farewell letter to an intimate friend, entrusting her with her diary and personal correspondence, and I quote, "In the event of my death, something can always happen while traveling." She then confided in her diary, "The world is now so terrible, tense. It is frightful for my many friends. I worry, my heart is torn for them. If I don't fall underneath the wheel of history, it will be almost a miracle." Unlike his delightful previous vacations spent in the Caucasus and traveling all over the country, Maisky was confined this time to a sanatorium near Moscow. These are the good old days in Sochi. The constant stream of postcards to his friends in England depicted the serene location surrounded by beautiful, most invigorating pine woods, from where he failed to tell them, of course, that he could obviously be summoned to the capital any moment. Maisky was indeed called up to Narkomindel and forced to compose a confessional autobiography in which he admitted political short-sightedness and failed to recognize the enemies of the people within his own embassy. He was confronted with testimonies extracted from his former subordinates, the military attaché and the head of the trade delegation. Both had given compromising evidence against him before being shot. He was then rushed to the Kremlin, where in the presence of Litvinov, Molotov, and Voroshilov, he was instructed to act in prudence. He was finally allowed to return to England on parole, so to speak, well aware of the vulnerability of his position. Shattered, Maisky returned to London the end of July, just in time for the Czechoslovak crisis now brewing. He confided with his most intimate friend, the socialist Beatrice Webb, telling her about the Kremlin's coldness towards Great Britain, hatred of Chamberlain as the enemy, concern about Czechoslovakia, and coolness towards the present French government. There was a strong temptation for Stalin, he said, to keep out of the European war. Just to remind you, this is 1938. With Litvinov increasingly hamstrung by the skepticism and vacillation of the Kremlin, depressed by severe marital problems which led his English wife, Ivy, to move away to Sverdlovsk, and crippled by the purges in his ministry, Maisky would now become the champion of collective security. I do not have sufficient time to dwell on the negotiation leading to the Munich Agreement. Suffice it to say that the archival material establishes beyond doubt that while a unilateral Soviet assistance was never on the cards, the Soviet commitment to contractual obligations with France and Czechoslovakia from 1935, conditioned on France acting first, remained unshaken. The Munich Agreement, from which the Soviet Union was excluded, proved to be Litvinov's swan song, although his outlook increasingly conformed to the isolationist views held in the Kremlin. Maisky was severely reprimanded for having failed to critically respond to the deceitful inventions of Halifax and others. In your reports of these conversations, we fail to see a critical reaction. One gets the impression that you seriously accept this eyewash, which, however, should have been all too obvious to you. The lessons drawn from Munich for the future negotiations was the need to avoid an agreement on mutual assistance similar to the one Russia had concluded with France in 1935, which lacked teeth to bite with. There was no ambiguity about the Soviet condemnation of Hitler's annexation of Czechoslovakia, or of the remaining of Czechoslovakia, on the 15th of March 1939. But Litvinov, who remained highly skeptical, forbade his diplomats from taking any initiative. If Britain and France genuinely changed their line, he instructed them, they should either make their views on our former proposals known, or else offer their own. The initiative must be left to them. There was much ambiguity in the British unconditional guarantees to Poland given on the 31st of March. To his inner circle, it was clear that Chamberlain was unhappy in his new role as the architect of, and I quote, a diluted collective security. To the opposition, it seemed to be Munich and the betrayal of the Czechs once again. It should be stressed that Chamberlain opted for Poland rather than Russia as an ally against the firm advice of the chiefs of staff. By so doing, he did not only push the Russians further into isolation, but also inadvertently created conducive conditions for a Soviet-German rapprochement. It is my firm belief that the guarantees to Poland paved the way to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and were the opening salvo of the Second World War. By guaranteeing Poland, Chamberlain practically abandoned Britain's traditional role as the arbitrator of the European balance of power and confronted Germany. The guarantees, it should be noticed, were mainly aimed at deterring Hitler and bringing him back to the negotiation table. Chamberlain overlooked the predicament that Hitler might persevere in his territorial claims against Poland. If so, the military axiom for Hitler, inspired by past experience of avoiding a war to France, would make it imperative for the Nazis to seek an agreement with the Soviet Union. Consequently, a German option, inaccessible to the Russians since 1934, suddenly opened up. Conversely, once it did dawn on Chamberlain that the path to a second Munich was not plain sailing, he would reluctantly be forced to secure at least a measure of Soviet military commitment, vital for the implementation of the guarantees. In this manner, and without prior Soviet design, the Soviet Union now became the pivot of the European balance of power. Litvinov explained the situation plainly to his ambassador in Berlin. We know full well that it is impossible to restrain and halt aggression in Europe without us, and later, our help will be sought, which will cost them dearer, and they will have to repay us. That is why we remain so placid in the face of what is referred to as the change of British policy. This was clearly a muted criticism of Maisky's opinions. The role assigned to the Soviet Union was disappointing. The British proposals handed to Maisky in mid-April called for a unilateral Soviet declaration of help to the victims of aggression to be issued on their own initiatives, not together with France and Britain, fastidiously restricted by qualifications which Halifax hoped would have a steadying effect upon the international situation. The steadying effect clearly reflected the deterrent element in the British policy, always seeking to resort to reconciliation with Germany. Chamberlain, no wonder that Litvinov retained his skeptical outlook. He suspected that Britain sought from Russia, and I quote, some sort of a binding promise without entering into any agreement and without undertaking any commitment. It was intolerable for the Russians, he added in a telegram to Maisky, to be in the situation when a man is invited to a party and then asked not to come because the other guests do not wish to meet them. We would prefer to be crossed off the guest list altogether. Litvinov was therefore furious about Maisky's unauthorized initiatives. He took the unusual step of seeking Stalin's approval for a telegram he sent the ambassador, demanding that Comrade Maisky should be instructed to assume a more reserved attitude in his conversations with representatives of the British government. And yet, Maisky's dogged determination to open an active dialogue with the British did finally resonate with Litvinov, who urged Stalin to abandon the reactive attitude and reveal a number of our preferred options. Litvinov's compromise-oriented proposals were replaced, however, by Stalin and Molotov on 17 April with rigid and harsh demands for a binding, full-blown triple alliance backed by a prompt military agreement. Litvinov attempted in vain. Maisky, however, was horrified when a day later he received an order to proceed immediately to Moscow. Litvinov attempted in vain to shield him, arguing that the embassy would cease to function, for there is no one who could conduct serious diplomatic negotiations with whom the English would take notice of. Suritz, who was also recalled from Paris, succeeded in sending his counselor instead. Mirakulov, the third Soviet ambassador's recalled, was never to return to Berlin. In the few days before his departure to Moscow, Maisky toiled day and night to set up a safety net. The nightmarish memories of his recall to Moscow the previous summer were still fresh in his mind. He made sure that the editors of the leading newspapers would be well familiarized with his itinerary, assuring them that they should expect to see him again in a few days with fresh proposals. The press, he described with relief in his diary, makes a first-class sensation of my trip to Moscow. The British government seems to be greatly concerned about my being summoned to Moscow and wants to convince me before I leave, and the Soviet government through me, of its sincere wish to work together with us on the establishment of a peace front. To his close friends, he explained that the purpose of the recall was to dispel Stalin's suspicion. Now, in his memoirs, Maisky encapsulates in a single muted paragraph what he describes as the unforgettable meeting in the Kremlin on the 21st of April. Surprisingly, this event, a landmark on the way to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, has been overlooked by historians. It took place in the early afternoon and lasted for more than 3.5 hours. Molotov, Mikoyan, Kaganovich, and Voroshilov, the entire Politburo, Chetviorka, in charge of foreign affairs, were present, as well as Litvinov. The counselor at the Paris embassy had met Stalin on his own at noon for 40 minutes, leaving him with a gloomy picture of the French total subservience to the British. At the end of a thorough debriefing of Maisky on the general mood in Britain, on the political perspectives and relationship between the supporters and opponents of the alliance, he was asked to evaluate the prospects of a positive response to the Soviet proposals. His brief, clearly apologetic account in his memoir conceals from his readers how shocking it was for him to observe for the first time, and I quote, the strained to the extreme relationship between Litvinov, Stalin, and Molotov. Equally, that he found the mood in Moscow to be disturbingly troubled by news that Hitler was seriously prepared for war. He later confided that Molotov, and I quote, turned out violent, colliding with Litvinov incessantly, accusing him of every kind of mortal sin. The prevailing opinion, which Maisky omitted from his memoir and diary, was the belief, and I quote, that there was a plot in London and Paris to involve Moscow in a war and then leave her in the lurch. Neither does Maisky mention Molotov's insistence that alternative options, including the improvement of relations with Germany, should be considered. Maisky's fleeting account of the meeting in the memoirs covers up the crucial fact that once he had become acquainted with the mood in Moscow, his relatively optimistic outlook on the eve of his departure to Moscow gave way to what he described in his memoirs as a not very consoling report. Others who were present at the meeting thought it was a devastating prognosis on Chamberlain's policies, thereby further inflaming Stalin's obsessive fear about the likelihood of a second Munich. Maisky's survey unwittingly compromised Litvinov, who refused to subscribe to the view that England and France were maliciously trying to embroil Germany at war with the Soviet Union. But far more important, the report encouraged Stalin to probe further into the German option with Merekalov, who was now hastily summoned to the Kremlin for the last hour of the meeting. Stalin addressed him as ambassador in Berlin point blank. Will the Germans advance on us, or won't they? Much under the impression of his meeting with the German State Secretary a couple of days earlier, in which Weizsäcker had suggested that economic negotiations might lead to political ones, Merekalov confirmed the intelligence report, but actually dwelt at length on the positive prospects of at least a short-term rapprochement with Germany. Now, this meeting, sometimes picture can tell a story much better than words can do, and images can do it without the photographers being aware of the drama. Because again, this story about the meeting in April in Moscow, except for the few lines in Maisky's memoir, are not mentioned anywhere. And so here we have 4 photos taken by journalists of Maisky leaving for Moscow. I think his face doesn't leave much doubt as to what his feelings are. A meeting with Kollontai in Stockholm on the way, arrival in Moscow, and return to London. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 3rd of May, all Soviet ambassadors were informed in a cryptic telegram, unusually signed by Stalin, of Litvinov's dismissal, attributed to a serious conflict between him and Molotov, ensuing from the disloyal attitude of Comrade Litvinov. The dismissal had colossal repercussions in the international scene and on Maisky personally. A protege of Litvinov, Maisky lost his sanctuary at the stroke. Yet, I would consider it a mistake to exclusively blame appeasement and the bankruptcy of collective security associated with Litvinov for his ousting. Even Maisky, who in April had spared no effort attuning to the views held in the Kremlin, continued to maintain that appeasement was being increasingly challenged in Britain. The explanation should rather be sought within the wider context of the purges and the construction of the Stalinist edifice, a process which now led to the cleansing of Narkomindel from the cadre of the first generation of Soviet cosmopolitan diplomats. Litvinov, who had never been a member of Stalin's inner court or the Politburo, was in fact blamed by Molotov for his failure to pursue the party line, and I quote, for clinging to a number of people alien and hostile to the party and to the Soviet state. What may have further precipitated Litvinov's dismissal was the verbatim report of the interrogation of Beria's predecessor, Yezhov, conveyed to Stalin by Beria a few days after the crucial April meeting. It led to a preliminary investigation on Litvinov's high treason by the NKVD, Yezhov recalled how unexpectedly he found himself spending a cheerful evening with Litvinov in a sanatorium in Merano in Italy. After dancing a foxtrot, Litvinov teased him. Here we are relaxing, going to restaurants, dancing, but if they found out about it in the USSR, they'd really kick up a fuss. Nothing particularly terrible is happening here. But you see, we have no culture. Our statesmen have absolutely no culture whatsoever. If our political leader established personal relationship with European political figures, a lot of sharp corners in our relations with other countries could be smoothed out. Meanwhile, in London, Maisky's patience and subversive activities were starting to pay dividends. In mid-May, Chamberlain no longer found it possible to withstand the domestic political pressure and the Chief of Staff support for an alliance. He complained that Churchill, Eden, and Lloyd George were working hand in hand with Maisky to topple him from power. He anticipated trouble from the Russians, who had no understanding of other countries' mentality or conditions and no manners. Although on the face of it, Chamberlain succumbed to the will of the majority of cabinet, according to his own admission, he had no intention of seeing the alliance materialize. Maisky, however, and this is an interesting point, believed that only psychological reasons were making it difficult for Chamberlain, and I quote, to swallow the idea of attack, since it would throw him into an anti-German camp once and for all, thus putting an end to all projects aimed at reviving appeasement. That is why Chamberlain keeps bargaining with us like an old gypsy, trying to foist a bad horse on us instead of a good one. It won't work. In his messages to Molotov, Maisky kept insisting that despite Chamberlain's efforts to avoid a war alliance, his own reliable sources in England were convinced that, I quote, at the end, the Prime Minister will have to do what Stalin wants. He was confident, as he wrote to Kollontai, that the alliance would be formed in the not-too-distant future. He likewise informed Lloyd George that he was, and I quote, certain that an agreement would be reached. The British government has now come 75% of the way, and are bound to come the whole 100%. To try and establish whether the Triple Alliance remained a viable alternative to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, as Maisky and Litvinov religiously maintained during and after the signing of the pact, it is useful to briefly re-examine the parallel German-Soviet negotiations. Just as Soviet policies were analyzed by Chamberlain and Halifax through an ideological tinted prism, Stalin's decision to pursue the German option emerged from an obsessive suspicion that Britain and France were actively plotting behind his back to divert Hitler against communist Russia. Economic negotiations with the Germans, which opened in 1938, made strides in January 1939. Stalin, however, kept the negotiations on a low file, suspecting that Hitler's overtures were mainly aimed at undermining his negotiations with the British for a Triple Alliance and encouraging Chamberlain to extend the scope of the Munich Agreement. The dramatic meeting in the Kremlin on the 21st of April, which I described just now, certainly marked a cautious turning point. Merely a fortnight later, Hitler issued Operation Weiss, a directive for the attack on Poland. Within a week, Stalin was informed in detail about the German design by his military intelligence. What he learned only reinforced his suspicion of a collusion between Germany and Britain. While Maisky remained confident about the prospects of concluding an agreement with the West, Molotov's attitude stiffened. A detailed memorandum, 12 pages long, which has hitherto eluded historians, was prepared for Molotov at his request on the 15th of May. This is the only document I'm going to show, or part of it. Bearing the title, English Diplomacy's Dark Maneuvers in August 1914. It aspired to demonstrate how those, and I quote, resemble very closely the maneuver of May 1939. Reading through it attentively, Molotov underlined numerous references to the alleged British consent in 1914 to remain neutral and guarantee France's passivity were Germany to divert the war to the east. He was furious that the British negotiators, crooks and cheats, as he referred to them, were resorting to clumsy tricks while digging in their heels. The Germans persevered in their attempts to put Stalin's mind at rest. On 15 May, he was informed that Germany entertained no aggressive intentions towards the USSR. In a follow-up meeting with Schulenburg, the German ambassador in Moscow, Molotov demanded a proper political base for the negotiations. A week later, he was reassured by sources close to Hitler that Germany harbored no aggressive intentions against Russia, and that ideological differences should not be an obstacle for normalization of relations. There was even a hint about a possible agreement on spheres of influence. In early June, just as Molotov was submitting his final draft treaty to London, Stalin addressed Molotov with rare handwritten instructions to find out how serious were German intentions, as he could, and I quote, not accept that negotiations might again be interrupted unexpectedly for unknown reasons. On 19 June, Stalin received intelligence from the headquarters of the Wehrmacht. General Kleist was purported to have said that Hitler was determined to solve the Polish questions at all costs, even at the risk of fighting a war on two fronts. Hitler, however, envisaged a Euro-Palace stage. He was confident that Russia would embark on negotiations, quote, as she was hardly anxious to be defeated for the sake of England and France. Molotov was now set on extracting a watertight agreement from either the British or the Russians. By mid-July, the bone of contention in the negotiations with the West remained the right of transit of Soviet troops through Polish territory to face the Germans, and the simultaneous conclusion of political and military agreement. Still reluctant to commit Britain to an alliance, Chamberlain intensified his attempts to deter Hitler from resorting to force by offering various economic incentives, including a full-blown economic partnership and the recognition of Germany's hegemony over Central and Eastern Europe, though in return, Hitler was expected to renounce forcible aggression as an instrument of international policy. Those feelers were leaked to the press, further fueling Soviet suspicion. Nonetheless, Maisky continued to adhere to his unshakable belief that an agreement was inevitable. He was particularly encouraged by what he considered to be the Kremlin's remarkable, important decision on 25th of July to receive an Anglo-French military mission to discuss the possibility of an alliance in Moscow. As often is the case, Maisky's apologetic memoirs are deliberately misleading. He misconstrues a narrative in which Halifax's refusal to travel to Moscow in June, sending a minor official instead, and the bizarre episode of the military mission, which left for Moscow on board a slow cargo ship headed by a secondary figure lacking any authority to discuss core issues, startled him and convinced him once and for all that an agreement was doomed. This narrative, meticulously constructed and disseminated by Maisky to justify the conclusion of the pact, was later adopted by Stalin and became the official, simplistic but rather effective Soviet narrative of the decision to sign the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Maisky's version is refuted by the better judgment he himself had at the time, a testimony of his inner thoughts. Returning from St. Pancras railway station, where he had seen the military delegation off, he wrote in his diary, and I quote, "I could not help smiling at history's mischievous sense of humor. The subjective conditions seem to be favorable for an Anglo-German agreement against the USSR. Chamberlain is still dreaming of appeasement, while Hitler is fervently trying to hold on to the tenets of Mein Kampf, seeking a bloc with England. And yet, regardless of Chamberlain's many attempts to forget, to forgive, to reconcile, to come to terms, something fateful always occurs to further widen the abyss between London and Berlin. Why? because the vital interests of two powers, the objective factor, prove diametrically opposed. The same applies to Anglo-Soviet relations. The bourgeoisie and the court dislike, even loathe, Soviet communism. Not that Moscow has great empathy towards the upper 10,000 of Great Britain. The burden of the past and ideological practice have all combined to poison our subjective attitude towards the ruling elite in England, and especially the Prime Minister, with the venom of fully justified suspicion and mistrust. And yet, the abyss between London and Moscow keeps narrowing. Field engineers are successfully fixing beams and rafters to support the bridge of the remaining distance. Why? Because the vital interests of the two powers, the objective factor, coincide. The journey of the military mission to Moscow is a historical landmark. What an irony that it should fall on Chamberlain to build the Anglo-Soviet bloc against Germany. The construction of the bridge, however, would have to be postponed until the 22nd of June 1941. On 10th of July, the Germans accepted the Soviet terms of linking the economic and political negotiations, eliciting from Stalin a spontaneous reaction. We are ready to move ahead. Further negotiations, however, stalled until the 26th of July, when the Germans increased the pressure, eventually agreeing to discuss any issue concerning the interests of two countries from the Black Sea to the Baltics. On 12 August, anticipating the conflict with Poland, Ribbentrop appeared eager to move quickly from the economic to the political agreement, and was even prepared to come to Moscow. By 16 August, the forlorn military negotiations with the West had reached a deadlock. The following day, Molotov raised with Schulenburg the idea of a non-aggression pact and a special protocol, addressing the mutual interests of both countries. The text of such an agreement was ironed out by both sides on the 19th of August. 2 days later, Hitler addressed Stalin personally with an ultimatum, demanding that Ribbentrop arrive in Moscow in the next couple of days and sign an agreement. Stalin responded within 2 hours. Ribbentrop arrived in Moscow on 23rd of August, and on the same day, he and Molotov attached the signature to the fateful document. Is then the jury out, ready to convincingly return a verdict on the case, curiously chosen by Maisky for the title of his memoirs, Who Had Hitler? I believe that his voluminous diary, crossed with the newly unearthed evidence and combined with the shifting paradigms of the debate, thus take us a long way towards a decision. It gives us a rare insight into the personal process of the formulation of Soviet and British foreign policy on the eve of the war. It manifests a surprisingly high degree of latitude and maneuverability which Soviet diplomats enjoyed, the existence of conflicting alternatives which were fought over in the Kremlin, and the personal and cultural rivalries at play. In other words, the complexities of the policies which can no longer be summarized in a single anonymous label, Soviet policy. We also witnessed the disastrous impact of Stalin's terror on the process of decision-making, shifting free thinking, stifling free thinking, and eliminating alternatives to a pact with Germany, which both Maisky and Litvinov continued to hold, did exist. Likewise in Britain, the personal and authoritarian handling of the foreign policy by Chamberlain, who kept rejecting the alternatives to appeasement advocated by the Chief of Staff, members of his cabinet, and the public at large, prevented the emergence of a grand alliance to forestall the war. Paradoxically, what seemed on the face of it to be a policy based on the premises of realpolitik was compromised on both sides by irrational, lingering prejudices and preconceived ideas. What it boils down to is that both the Soviet Union and the democracies pursued a course which was neither morally nor ideologically consistent. Moscow's policy, like that of the democracies, was neither pure and noble nor diabolically cunning. Thank you.
So the floor is now open for questions. one wants to begin, I will begin. I really appreciated how contingent the situation appears in your account with the three powers jockeying. And my question is about anti-British sentiment among the Soviets, because unlike the situation with Germany where they had cooperated in the 20s and had a series of alliances, Britain was the traditional enemy. It was the incarnation of imperialism. And what also comes across in your account is the very deep distrust of Britain that Stalin and Molotov shared. What I cannot quite understand is Litvinov's initial distrust of Britain and why that was so present. But in relation to your argument about the sort of the role of ideology, couldn't there this traditional distrust of British imperialism be a kind of more diffuse element, ideological element at play?
Thank you for the answer, for the question. That is, I wish it were the answer, but it is a question which I have to contend with. There were a series of questions, so I'll try and respond to all of them briefly. I'll start with the end because throughout my academic career, I've been sort of confronted with this issue of ideology and reality. I would fully agree with you that ideology plays a major role, but in a different way than we are used to define ideology. Because throughout the Cold War, ideology was explained and analyzed in a very simplistic term as a blueprint for the communization of the rest of the world. And so the question is, was there a predetermined plan here to eventually get to the Ribbentrop-Molotov? The argument used by about 50% of the scholars who side with the idea that Stalin maliciously signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov because he wanted to stay out of the war and have two capitalist countries bleed each other white and then move into the heart of Europe with communism. This is sort of, so if that is true, then most of the arguments that I've brought in my lecture would not stand the test of criticism. But I would say that ideology in that sense did not exist and had stopped existing actually once the Soviets realized that their national interests collided and were undermined very much by ideology. And that happened more or less in 1927 with the rise of Stalin. But there was something else. There was the ideological, I mean, the people did believe in the ideas behind, but they did not make them the modus operandi. So they were working within a culture of ideology, and that led to preconceived ideas. So many of the preconceived ideas that I described, actually one can ascribe to. You can remember this description Maisky had. It said, well, you know, we hate them also, we have no love for the 20,000 and so on, but you could still analyze the politics in a mechanistic and very logistic, legalistic and realistic way. So I would say ideology, yes, we have to redefine ideology, and the old dichotomy of realpolitik and ideology is no longer an issue, I think.
And Litvinov's initial opposition?
Now, I think this is a major discovery that I had, because usually Maisky and Litvinov are twinned together. It's those couple. There is a tendency in Russian history, because we had no access to private archives, there is a tendency to generalize. And so we have Zinoviev and Kamenev, and very few people would be able to actually say what was the difference between the two, but it was a tremendous, but they're still coupled. So you have those coupling, the groups. And so Litvinov and Maisky have been coupled together as the proponents of collective security, and then of course Litvinov dismissed because of the failure. And my argument is that it is not really the failure of the policy, but part of this, the terror in building the Stalinist edifice. And that in fact there was a major difference, and Litvinov did think in terms of realpolitik that, for reasons which I also tried to explain during the lecture, Russia could retain passivity and maintain isolation, but not in the ideological sense of waiting, for the capitalist countries to bleed away, but because no side would be able to win a war without the support of the Soviet Union, which history is proved to be right throughout the 20th century. Coming back to the attitude to England, I fully agree with you that there is this lingering imperial rivalry, which defines really the relations between the two countries. So what is interesting is how this is then combined with the anti-communism. And a lot of the anti-communist ideas are just a reinforcement of the past imperial rivalry. And the same thing is true in Russia, because Stalin tends to think historically as well. And he's trying to redress from 39 to 41, and that was the main topic of my book. He tries to redress what he thinks were the injustices inflicted on Russia in the 19th century, mostly the Crimean War and so on. So there is this legacy. On the other hand, there's also the memory of fighting as an allies of England in the First World War.
Yes, Pavel Sternov from the Institute of World Politics. I wanted to ask one thing. As far as factors facilitating the German-Soviet pact, what about the fact that the British didn't really offer, from the Soviet viewpoint, the British didn't really offer Moscow anything that Moscow could have wanted, especially territory and expansion. Obviously, the Soviets wanted to seize as much territory as possible, especially in the
No,
Baltics.
you see, you're
Poland.
speaking, this is the language you're using now is exactly the language that I really oppose, because it assumes that Soviet policy was ideologically motivated, and the aim of it was to seize as much territory, and obviously territory for communizing or advancing the revolution. My argument would be right. I mean, this is easy to prove that all they wanted really to achieve, and they defined very clearly, unlike the other powers, they defined the national interest. And the national interests were to establish the buffer zone, because of the problem of the Russian borders, which are long and vulnerable, and you are unable to defend them in traditional sort of Maginot, similar to the Maginot. And so the need to establish spheres of influence. The spheres of influence was, continued to be, and still is at the heart of Russian political thinking. So it was very confined. I mean, the demands were very confined. At the end of the war, they found themselves to be in areas which they did not actually anticipate being, and that may actually undermine their position later on.
Except I didn't mention ideology, I mentioned territory, territorial expansion. That is separate from ideology. I didn't necessarily say they want to communize those guys. I said they were hoping to take it over, especially since it had been part of the Tsarist Empire for quite a while. So I didn't really mention ideology here specifically.
So where would you go from there? I mean, what would be your question then?
I guess you answered most of my question. I just wanted to point out I wasn't talking about ideology.
Yeah, okay.
So.
Anton Piyash, American University. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to go back to the question of Molotov's relationship with Maisky, and I'm a little bit unclear. Why does Molotov leave him, and what's at stake for Molotov removing Litvinov and then decapitating the Litvinov network within the ministry, and yet leaving Maisky in place? Is the simple answer?
So the question is really, how come that Maisky, of all the ambassadors, the only one who had actually been on the right of the Menshevik Party, the only one to have fought against Stalin, succeeded in not being arrested until the age of 70. Quite an interesting topic on its own, which I went into, the arrest and trial, and of course the memoirs he writes is immediately after his release from prison. And therefore they have to be apologetic, and they serve, of course, the Russians in the Cold War. So I think that he made himself indispensable in England. And as long as the British option existed, his survival was almost secure, unlike other ambassadors, because they were in positions which were less important. I can give you another example, which is the opposite, is for instance Mirakulov, that I mentioned earlier. Mirakulov was sent by Stalin to Germany in 1937. Now he had no experience in diplomacy at all. I mean, they took him, he was a party member, had no German, knew nothing about Germany, and he was sent to Germany in 1937. And suddenly his position becomes very important, because suddenly the door opens. So, and he is a number 2, Astafov, who actually conducts the real negotiation. Now, Astafov is being at that time under the investigation, just like Maisky and Litvino, and he knows that because he's being interrogated and had to do the same thing that Maisky did. So what Stalin does, without any problem at all, he recalls Mirakulov. He sends him away from Moscow because he knows too much and he may spill the beans. So he doesn't kill him, but he sends him somewhere in Siberia. And then lets Astafov become practically the ambassador. He never was really appointed as an ambassador. And he conducts the negotiation leading to the Ribbentrop-Molotov. He comes to Moscow with Ribbentrop and immediately arrested and shot. I mean, he's done his bit, you see. And so I think that Maisky was extremely successful in surviving, but there was always a grudge against him. And in the Russian version of Gromyko's memoirs, which is about twice as long as the other, there's a whole chapter on Maisky, and he says, we've never trusted him. We never, and there is this rivalry, of course, it's the traditional rivalry between the revolutionaries in exile and those who actually worked in Russia. And there's a competition, there's a political competition between Molotov and Litvino as to who was going to. And then eventually, in 1943, Molotov succeeds in removing Maisky from London in the middle of a crisis, over the question of the Second Front. And he sends one of his men, Gusiev, who was about 29 years old, didn't have a word of English, and no access to anyone. But he always succeeded in manipulating until a certain moment where he failed.
But there is another side to the story, which is that to Molotov then, until August of 1939, England clearly mattered so much that
so
Maisky was, that's precisely
indispensable.
why, right.
Yes.
So,
That explains why he survived 37, but why did he survive 39? Is it because of the purges and
Because once Russia signs the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and particularly partitions Poland, there is the fear that England would join actually Germany in diverting the war again to the east, and especially after the war in Finland, the Winter War, where the British do have plans to do two things. First of all is to bomb the Caucasus oil field, which would then introduce actually a situation of war. And the other is to help assist Finland. So again, his position became indispensable because he has these connections with Churchill, who was in opposition, but now he and Eden are actually in Germany's government. And so he succeeds actually in remaining there until 1941. And then 1941 he becomes really important. He becomes so important, and don't forget that he symbolizes for the British the Russian struggle. I mean, who is after all assisting the British? Who is the only party that actually fights the war? It's the Russian. And so he starts having painters do his paintings and busts. Epstein, the famous avant-garde sculptor, did his bust. And Kokoschka, the Austrian painter, did paintings of his. You can imagine how much that was liked in the Kremlin.
but not nude descending a staircase. No portraits of him naked descending a staircase.
No. None that have survived.
No.
colleague.
Sorry.
Does France disappear from the story mostly because Maisky is in London, or have they really become simply an appendage of British policy by this time?
That is the answer. I mean, because in France you actually have another ambassador who is very powerful, Sorit, and he's very much involved, and he sees the situation more or less in the same eyes, just like he belongs to the same clique. There is a clique there. You see, the funny thing, when you think about it, I mean, if you try to look at it from Stalin's point of view, there is a clique, there is the Litvinov clique. And Litvinov is not a yes man. I mean, Maisky's survival is through this manipulation, or for instance, when he comes to Moscow, and he's convinced that the best line for the Russian is just to wait, because the pressure on Chamberlain is so tremendous that he would have to change the policy. Comes to Moscow and sees, he has one day, but in the one day he talks to Molotov and other, and realizes that his line is the wrong one, so he changes his line. But Litvinov wasn't like that. And when there were rumors, for instance, about his arrest in 1938, he went straight to Stalin and said, well, I understand that I'm now on your list and you're going to shoot me. And then Stalin dismissed, oh, what are you talking about? What a joke, So he had that, he had this integrity. And there were different techniques of survival.
I wonder whether you could comment on Soviet policy in Spain during this period. And in particular, I wonder, there was a decision at some point in, I think, 1937 to sort of scale back the level of support for the Republican forces in Spain. Have you gleaned any new insights into the calculations that went behind that? Was that part of an sort of initial hinting of possible opening to a deal with the Germans, or was it because the British were getting too upset about communist power?
Well, the diary is really full of Spain for the simple reason that Maisky was the Soviet representative that and at least throughout 1 year, the head of the non-intervention committee set up in London. There was a major debate, really. And we have to remember that one of the reasons why there is that kind of pluralism in a system which you do not expect to see this pluralism is because that is the way Stalin pursued policies. I mean, he did not initiate, he never initiated any policy in foreign politics. What he would do, he would have a number of options at play, and then he would adopt one of them and shoot whoever was on the wrong side. And so on the issue of Spain, there is a major debate, really. And again, we find Litvinov and Maisky on the wrong, different sides. Because Maisky thought that if the Soviets scaled down the assistance, it would undermine the position among the left and so on, and the support that Russia had in Britain. And Litvinov thought that it really hampered his attempts at that time to bring the reconciliation and start the negotiations. And his line actually won. So again, we see that when it comes to ideology and realpolitik, and the two collide, the interests of the state emerge always on top.
So Litvinov believed in appeasing the British, in a sense?
At that time, yes, because this precedes, of course, what happens later.
Well, I'm totally overwhelmed by this, I must admit. And I'm someone who's a medievalist. David Goldberg, I teach Russian history.
It reminds you of medieval...
I'm a medievalist.
No, I mean, the scenes in the Kremlin remind very much of what we think.
Very medieval, right, very interesting. Yeah, I see that.
Because, sorry, just to tell you a small anecdote, is that Stalin's favorite book was The Prince, Machiavelli's, which he had translated for him, and which is marked, in all possible colors.
Probably. He could have probably written the Arthashastra too or something. But I guess there are a lot of complex. There's so many complex thoughts I have because I have looked at this. And at one time I even taught undergraduate history of Soviet foreign policy way back years ago. When we had to do the Cold War stuff. Actually, bringing up the Spanish Civil War immediately makes me think of two other explanations that I read way back then. One was that actually Stalin or some of his thinkers, some of the people around him realized that the last thing the Soviet Union needed was success of a Red Spain.
Yes.
And there being only a Red Spain and the Soviet Union, and that could lead to a grand coalition of all the other powers against it.
Yes.
Another one was the growing Japanese threat.
Yes.
And to realize that it was crazy to get exposed in Europe when there was a material threat out in the Far East that had to be dealt with. I guess my big question is this: if the textbook that we used to use in the old days, and then we'd teach against it if we had different ideas, was Ullum's.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that was the one way, and then we'd teach against it if we had, in the way we all teach individualistic.
With whom I clashed on the Munich Agreement in writing. Because I wrote a review of his book, and then he did something which we are always told we should not do, and he wrote a rebuttal.
Well, I'll stay out of that one. Let me come on to my question. What book or books to review the history of Soviet foreign policy, let's say through the Stalin period, or at least through World War II, would you recommend that someone like me, who still will teach a survey course in Russian history, ought to read in order to update on all types of new information that's come out, and then particularly the types of insights that you've gleaned from this great work that you've done with the original sources?
If I were modest, I would say, well, wait for the 3 volumes. Well, I think my point is that this history needs now to be rewritten. That is my point. And at the moment, the Russians haven't done that. The Russians haven't done that because, you see, what I'm trying to show is that the agreement was not signed really at the 12th hour because there was no alternative. I'm trying to show that actually the Kremlin faced the alternative, created the alternative, widened the alternatives, and they made the choice. Now we can discuss, the discussion now should be, was that the right choice? Because we see that there was an alternative there. There was an alternative which was considered by the people at the time. It's not that we now are clever and we know that eventually the Germans attacked Russia in the 22nd of June. But at the time, there was a significant, knowledgeable body of opinion in the Russian foreign ministry that believed that this was a viable option. And one had to wait, you see. So this is a major change. But that would indicate that the Russians were considering seriously negotiating with the fascists. And because of what happened on the 22nd of June, and the need, of course, to explain the mistakes and so on, the other narrative had to be embedded, and the Russians adhere to it until today, and today even more than before. And the archives are very much closed on anything which hints towards this possibility that they were actually considering the 2 alternatives.
But let me ask a pointed question, since you talk about it seems to me what you said is that given the policies that the French and British were actually pursuing, there was no alternative but the pact. My question is that supposing the British had a Churchill in power, who's willing to send a military mission which says, yes, we want an alliance with you, and this means that we and the French will muscle the Romanians, the Poles, and the Baltic states, so that you can have the strategic wherewithal, or the logistic wherewithal to be a viable threat to Germany from the east, which you won't be if you have no passage through Romania and Poland, and you have no Baltic ports.
Yes.
All right, and so, I mean, if that's the case, then do the Soviet leaders really have an alternative? Because it seems to me, again,
Yes.
they had no alternative.
Yeah, but again, you have to look into the domestic politics in England, you see, and the question is, whom do you expect Churchill and Eden? I mean, looking ahead, do you expect them eventually, under changing circumstances, to replace Chamberlain? Chamberlain himself writes in his correspondence with his sister, which is just like a diary. He writes at a certain moment, well, if it comes to war, then I'm going to step down because I'm a leader for peacetime but not for war, and I let Eden or Churchill or Halifax take over. So there was that possibility, you see. And Maisky and others recognized that possibility and worked on it very hard. Worked on it in a subversive way, which was not today. You are used to sort of countries interfering in domestic affairs of others, but that was not the case at that time. But the Russians had cultivated, and Churchill and Eden, who eventually do become the crucial and the key, for the alliance, do get into power. And Maisky foresaw it. You will see in the diary in 1939, he sees Churchill. He says, well, it may take 6 months. It may actually happen after the war breaks out, but within a year or so, he says, Churchill is bound to be the prime minister. And he cashed on him.
Just to add to that, it seems to me your position is somewhat revisionist towards Chamberlain as well, because you see this position in some of the literature that, Chamberlain and Churchill are not that far apart. They're still building up arms. They expect war. They're just delaying the start of the war. But in your account, there is a real difference.
I'm not a revisionist, but I'm
In the good sense of the word.
revisionist. Because what happened is that the revisionism tried to look into the constraints on Chamberlain, which prevented him actually from the alliance, and explained in rational terms why he had to adhere to appeasement. And I think one has to come back to what we call the guilty man, the earlier version, because if you start looking into prejudices and the impact of prejudices on the formulation of policy, you just cannot avoid or evade really see the tremendous impact that the emotions played in his policy making. And so what we see is something which is also striking, that in fact in Russia and in Britain, one is a democratic country, the other in a democratic society, the other one is totally totalitarian. But basically, the foreign policy is decided in a very similar way, because Chamberlain does not work with the foreign policy. He creates an office, he creates his own entourage and so on, and then he imposes his views and ideas on them, and that leads to decisions, fatal decisions like the guarantees and so on. In that respect,
So
I am-
revising the revisionists.
Yes.
One more question, yes.
Yes, thank you. Could we go back briefly to Munich?
Two?
Munich.
Yes.
How different was Maisky's assessment of the results of Munich from Stalin?
Maisky and to some extent at that time still Litvinov, but Litvinov is quite an interesting story because I just hinted to it that he was in a depression, which is interesting. I went and looked into the memoirs of his wife, Ivy Litvinov's, which are at Stanford, and they give you a real glimpse into the kind of mood and personal situation he was in that particular time. I won't get into it, although it's the most interesting because I think it's sort of sex and politics. And so he was anyway in a kind of depressive state, and his deputies had just been shot, just before Munich. He was left with no one, no support. His number two, Potemkin, was really undermining him, and this comes out in the diary wonderfully. And when Maisky describes how Potemkin tries to undermine Litvinov in inform on him to Moscow. So let's leave alone Litvinov. But Maisky definitely believed, I think the quote that I gave you at the end is the way that he looks, the big view he has. The objective conditions are such that, like in the First World War, like in the Second World War eventually, that the interests of England, despite this rivalry, the imperial rivalry, the interests of England and Russia coincide. And so, and what matters is really the interest. So eventually, whether you like or you don't like each other, you'll find yourself in the same camp. So he thought it was a passing episode. He thought that there would be a tremendous reaction against Chamberlain as a result of Munich, which in a way there was, and especially after the annexation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And he worked really hard to make sure that it happened. It's incredible. I mean, you read, I have all his correspondence with the heads of the leaders, the editors of all the journals, whom he, in the newspapers, whom he would constantly supply with caviar and vodka and so on. And he would dictate to them leaders, which were then published in all the leading papers, including Beaverbrook, who was such a conservative and imperialist, nonetheless.
Well, I know we could continue to discuss this for quite some time, but please join us in talking about it. We don't have caviar and vodka, but we do have a reception here. Please join me in thanking Gabriel.
Thank you.